So I started to say, what are my options here? And I was applying for jobs that just didn't really interest me. And one day I happened upon AmeriCorps through just searching, right, like what matches my skill sets. And I looked into it and I thought, wow, this is something I can do very similar to the Peace Corps, but stay here in the US and still be here with my new partner that I was dating. How funny those things are, right, when we're so young. And I found an opportunity with the Indiana Reading Corps that was housed through Indiana Campus Compact. And I applied to be the full-time AmeriCorps member, went through an interview process, and was accepted into AmeriCorps and into the idea of putting together what would become a statewide AmeriCorps program. The knowledge that I brought with me already from being an AmeriCorps member, coupled with my experience then working in higher ed, and then being a full-time staff member at Indiana Campus Compact, all of that together helped me write that proposal to get funding to support a new statewide AmeriCorps Direct program. It's really interesting too, and you probably find this in your experience. I started to see the longer I was in my role at Indiana Campus Compact, faculty being hired at the institutions were AmeriCorps alums, right?
Yes.
They had gone through AmeriCorps experiences. They had gone and done their PhDs, and they're now teaching on a college campus, and they're bringing that AmeriCorps passion with them. And they want to connect it to the learning objectives of their course and get their students engaged in their communities. So that felt really special too, to be able to work in that kind of capacity with faculty and start having a conversation about how do we help people talk about the stories behind those statistics, because every stat has a story behind it. And of course, Kelsey and I both had writing backgrounds. He was the author. I had a degree in writing. We started talking about how can we help people tell their story around poverty. And we quickly learned, once we started working with individuals who said, yeah, I'd love to tell my story to get it out there to combat this conversation, we quickly learned that not everybody could write their own story.
Yeah.
Some people had never learned to read or write, which was like pull a page right out of my AmeriCorps experience. So we had to step back and say, well, how do we make this an equitable experience so that if somebody wants to tell their story, they can? So we get the idea of partnering writers with the storytellers, regardless if you could write your own story, and everybody would have a storytelling partner. Really, this is relevant to anybody. If you're fresh out of AmeriCorps, or you are at retirement age, or you're in the middle place, is staying true to your passion. And so any project that I take on, if it's a writing project, if it's work that I'm doing a facing project, if it's something I'm trying to decide because somebody asked me like, hey, do you want to do this thing with me? And I have to ask the question, the what, why, and how. So everything I approach, I say, what is it that I care about in this moment? Why do I care about this thing? And how am I going to get other people to care about it too?
Welcome to the AmeriCorps Connections Podcast, the unofficial hub for AmeriCorps and National Service alum who are still showing up long after their service term is finished. If you've ever served, or you know someone who has, then you're in the right place. So AmeriCorps is a national service program that empowers people of all ages to address critical needs in our communities throughout the United States, from education and the environment to public health and economic opportunities. With these signature programs like VISTA, NCCC, AmeriCorps Seniors, Teach for America, Public Allies, City Year, Conservation Corps, and state and national. Members, thousands of members across the United States are stepping up and getting things done in our communities. But here's the thing. The service ends, but the mission doesn't. So, on the podcast, through real stories, honest reflections, and meaningful conversations, this podcast explores what comes next, how AmeriCorps alumni are still leading, still learning, and still getting things done. Because service never really ends. I'm your host, Nikki Fiacco, alum, advocate, and catalyst for connections. And I'm so glad that you found this podcast. And if you're tuning in and you're returning, welcome back. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and I hope you enjoy this episode. I'm excited to welcome J.R. Jameson to the AmeriCorps Connections Podcast.
JR is an AmeriCorps alum whose passion for service has shaped a powerful career rooted in empathy, storytelling, and of course, community. But it wasn't a straight path from AmeriCorps member to executive director. JR's journey, like so many of ours, was weaved together through a series of experiences, challenges, and choices that ultimately led him exactly where he's meant to be, leading a national movement that connects people through the power of story. As executive director of the Facing Project, JR has helped amplify thousands of voices across the country, creating spaces where community members can walk in each other's shoes and discover the strength of shared humanity. He's also an author, educator, and a podcast host whose work centers on lifting up unheard voices and reminding us all that our stories matter. On today's episode, we explore the transformative power of storytelling and lifelong impact of national service, and how leaning into the layers of our journey can lead us right where we need to begin. So let's jump in.
Yeah. So, without any further ado, I'm really excited to introduce J.R. Jameson. Said your name so much better this time. Who was AmeriCorps State Direct with the Indiana Reading Corps. So I'm going to just turn it over to you, JR, and tell us about how you found out about the AmeriCorps opportunity and what that looked like for you.
Hey, Nikki, thanks so much for having me. I'm really excited to be here to talk about AmeriCorps and with someone else who also is an alum and passionate about the AmeriCorps program overall. I did full-time AmeriCorps in 2001. I joined in June of 2001 and completed my service in June of 2002. And I did the Indiana Reading Corps, like you mentioned. I graduated from undergrad in 2001, May of 2001, and my degree is a double major in cultural geography and creative writing. And I really didn't know what I wanted to do, right? I wanted to write. I knew I wanted to be a writer. I knew I cared about people and storytelling. There wasn't a lot of job opportunities out there per se with a bachelor's degree in that. And so I was starting to consider my options. And I thought about joining Peace Corps. It seemed like something really interesting to do. I had studied abroad in China as an undergrad. So connecting all of these skills that I had through my degree and my study abroad experience, I thought I'm going to join the Peace Corps. But then I started dating someone, and right, how that happens when you're 21 years old and you have a new partner and you're like, oh no, but now I can't leave for 2 years to go do service somewhere halfway around the world. So I started to say, what are my options here? And I was applying for jobs that just didn't really interest me. And one day I happened upon AmeriCorps through just searching, right, like what matches my skill sets. And I looked into it and I thought, wow, this is something I can do very similar to the Peace Corps, but stay here in the US and still be here with my new partner that I was dating. How funny those things are, right, when we're so young. And I found an opportunity with the Indiana Reading Corps that was housed through Indiana Campus Compact. And I applied to be the full-time AmeriCorps member, went through an interview process, and was accepted into AmeriCorps and into that position. So as I mentioned before, I started my term in the summer of 2001. And what my role was in the Indiana Reading Corps was to work with 18 different literacy sites across the state of Indiana with their reading programs focused on mostly 3rd through 6th grade students who were at or below their reading level to help them get to their reading level or above by the end of the year.
I want to hear how your passion for storytelling and with your background and your undergraduate, how did you weave that passion into working with some of these youth that are just learning how to read? And I see, like, I had a hard time reading when I was a
Yeah.
kid. So I was more focused on just getting the words right. Remember that thing in elementary school where you go around the room and we'd all be reading and we'd all have a paragraph we had to read.
Yes, round
I
robin.
was, yes, I was so anxious.
That's a really intimidating time.
Yeah, like when's it my turn to read? And I would be using my fingers and messing up words. And I still do it now. My kids are like, you read so slow. But I don't know. What were some of the things that you inspired these kids to bump up their grade level? What were some of those things?
Yeah, so I'll first say I can completely relate to your experience because I too was in the program with kids who maybe needed a little bit of help. I wasn't in that top tier group. And the way it was done at my school, they literally had us as group A, B, and C. A were like the stellar readers, and they got to do some extra special things. And then B were just like the average, maybe need a little help. And then there were the C readers who were really struggling. I was in that B group. And just being aligned in that way felt just really odd, right? Because we felt
Yeah.
like, we're not great like the A's. But like you, I remember being in those groups and going around and reading, and sometimes I would struggle with word pronunciation and all of that. So I brought that experience with me as an adult as far as my own past experience. What I really enjoyed about the program is we focused on fun books for kids. It wasn't necessarily the books that we used in the 80s when you and I were in elementary school. My school was still using like See Spot Run, right? Or whatever, like Fun with Dick and Jane, these books from the 50s and 60s. And in this program, it was using books like Stone Soup and other books that helped kids use their imaginations while learning to read. But much like going around in those circles, we did that with the kids, but it was one-to-one. So they had a tutor they were replaced with, and the tutor helped them through that process word by word, through books that interest the students based on what are their favorite colors, what are some of their favorite animals. And what we would do is help find the right age appropriate books that would pull in their interest areas to help them while they're reading, fall in love with reading at the same time.
That's so exciting. Do you remember the story, George and the Giant Peach? Was that the name of
Oh,
it?
yes, totally. Yeah.
I had a fourth grade teacher who she was so expressive. When she read, she would get into character. Mrs. Freeman was her name. And she was just a big lady and she was a big personality. And
Yeah.
she would read these stories and we would just be like on the edge of our seats of just like, that was the first time that I really connected with
Yeah.
stories and like imagination, right? Like,
Yeah.
and I think because she was so good, go ahead.
Yeah, well, I was going to say that gets to different learning styles, right? Some readers need to look at the page and sound out the words. Other readers need to hear other people reading to them because, right, they connect with the language in that way. And while it's important to do really a mixed methods approach of all of that, the entry point into what interests a child, into falling in love with reading and understanding the words they're reading through comprehension, right? It's all of these things connected, but it's finding that entry point that brings the student into that story that helps them with their reading and writing skills.
Do you have any takeaway memories of any moments with students that were struggling or, I don't know, breakthrough moments, anything that you can recall?
Yeah, well, I have one story in particular that is actually kind of a sad story, but it did really set me forward on what I wanted to commit to after my time in AmeriCorps. So I was working with a student who was an eighth grader. So he was very old for our program. It was really rare that we had an eighth grader. I mean, like I said at the beginning, these were mostly third through sixth grade students. We had an eighth grader and he had never learned to read or write, but he was still
Wow.
an eighth grader. He just kept getting passed year to year to the next grade. And really, in some ways, I think some of the teachers had given up on him, to be quite honest. But what I learned through working with him is that his mom and dad had never learned to read or write. And he had a sister who was in the fifth grade who also could not read or write. And of course, we have these kids for a year trying to work with them. And while he did get better at sight words like at, than, be, can, like really easy sight words, he was able to get those and maybe a little beyond that. but that's all he could get to by the end of the year. And I remember leaving the program feeling a bit deflated around that because I just couldn't help but think, what's this kid's future?
Yeah.
Like what is there for him, right? And so maybe start thinking more about our educational system. And it started making me think about pre-service teachers in particular, which is what drew me to going into higher ed after my time in AmeriCorps. And so, well, that's not really an uplifting story that, is really heartwarming. It is a story that's really important and sadly is a story of so many kids in America.
There is a through line of almost everybody that I speak to who's an AmeriCorps alum that says, because during my service year, I experienced this, I wanted to make sure that I made this change. I wanted to make sure that I was able to give people opportunities to do X, Y, or Z. I wanted to make sure that I built the infrastructure of a city because I was an NCCC member. And I remember looking up at the stars. So I want the lights to dim so that people can look at the sky, right? A service year gives you an opportunity. It's like when you go into a job, you got to do the job. During your AmeriCorps year, you meet the mission, but you also can find your purpose. And I'm going to say purpose with a small p because we have purposes in increments. Like your purpose 10 years ago is different than your purpose now.
Yeah.
But I think what you're speaking to is a spark came to you where you were like, this sucks for that kid. And moving forward, what can I do? What can I do? So what did you do?
Well, I went to grad school to be honest, because I talked to a few mentors I had met throughout the program who worked in higher education, and I shared with them, this is kind of what I'm feeling, and they said, well, you're never going to get a job in higher education unless you have your master's. And so I did. I used my AmeriCorps Education Award connected to an assistantship that I got that provided other funding. And together that paid for my grad school. And I got my master's in education focused on higher ed. And after I finished my master's, I was hired by Ball State University in their Office of Leadership and Service Learning. And main role in that was to focus on our AmeriCorps programs that we offered through Ball State, but also to lead all of our alternative break programs and work with our student tutors who were working out in the elementary schools who were not necessarily connected to AmeriCorps. So I got to continue my passion of working with pre-service teachers who were engaged in volunteer and service learning programs at Ball State University.
And for folks that don't know where Ball State is, that's in Indiana. Is that right?
Yeah, in beautiful and wonderful Muncie, Indiana.
Oh, the whole story of Muncie. I've heard this before. Muncie. Where is Muncie in Indiana? Where is it?
So Muncie is in East Central Indiana. It's actually, if people are somewhat familiar with Indiana geography, I don't know if you are, but Indianapolis is right in the center of the state. That's our capital. And if you head about an hour northeast up I-69, you'll come to Muncie, Indiana. Or if people are familiar with Fort Wayne, you travel an hour southwest down 69 and you hit Muncie. So we're in the middle between Indianapolis and Fort Wayne. And about an hour from the Ohio border.
Got you. And that's where your post-AmeriCorps service and postgraduate story begins.
Yes.
So, so tell us the story. Tell us what you did next.
Yeah, so after I was hired by Ball State to work in the Office of Leadership and Service Learning, I was in that role for 2 years. I loved it, but an opportunity came calling at Indiana Campus Compact, where I had been a full-time AmeriCorps member through their Indiana Reading Corps program. And it was to be essentially the assistant director of their faculty and student programs. So I applied for the position. I was like, I don't know if I'm going to get it. And then I got an interview, and then I got a second interview, and then they offered me the job. So I started in that role in July of 2005. And I was in the role of assistant director of faculty and student development, I think was my official title, for a year. And then I was promoted to associate director of Indiana Campus Compact. And I stayed in that role until August of 2014 when I became the executive director. And I was in the executive director role until August of 2021.
Wow.
So really my AmeriCorps experience connected me to Indiana Campus Compact and, a little bit of time at Ball State and then back at Indiana Campus Compact where I spent 16 years in various capacities. And Indiana Campus Compact, for people who might not be familiar, it's now known as the Community Engaged Alliance. But Indiana Campus Compact was a state affiliate of Campus Compact. And it's a statewide organization working with colleges and universities to help them advance their service learning and community engagement initiatives on their campuses through professional development trainings, funding support, etc.
It's such a great example of the trajectory. My career did the same thing after my AmeriCorps year. It was funny. It was like I did my AmeriCorps year. If you think about a plane taking off, like my AmeriCorps year, I was getting on the plane, trying to put my baggage and whatever I need to put it, settling in. And then all of a sudden I did my AmeriCorps year and then I landed. And I still was trying to find my baggage and where am I supposed to go and how do I find my ground transportation? And that's where I spent some time in a couple nonprofits. And then I landed in state government. And a year later, I was promoted to program manager, director, executive director, boom, 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 boom. And it's like, oh my God, it can be a little bit like, and I don't know if you felt this way, but along the way, I shouldn't say this out loud. Never mind.
Don't just say it.
No, I can't. I'll tell you after.
Okay.
But even now, like along the way, I was, why do people trust me to do this?
Oh, yeah. No, I mean, even now, I'm like, I'm not old enough to have a real job. But then I'm like, oh, wait, yeah, I am. And I think that's the imposter syndrome that is in us. And I think everybody actually has. Very few people actually are willing to admit it.
Yeah.
But I think that's very true. We go through life moving through roles that we're qualified for and that people trust us and put us in the roles. But I think it's when we take on that extra responsibility, we kind of go inward and say, but am I really the best person for this role? And I think that gets to imposter syndrome, which just means that we're good people and we're not what's the appropriate way to say this? We're not narcissistic or ego-driven.
Yeah, and I think there's a happy medium. There's a happy medium of where you have the limiting beliefs of like, I can't do this because I'm not qualified to do it, which is not true. Basically, humans can figure out how to do everything. I will never dunk a basketball because I'm 5'3". But there's this physical limitations, but our mind, we can achieve things if we put our minds to it. Yeah. And one of the things that I would always, when I had that imposter syndrome or when I had that limiting mindset where I'm like, how are they entrusting me with all of this money or all of these opportunities or all of these people? It was a AmeriCorps member. During the pandemic, I was running the governor's office on service and volunteerism. And I was like, there's hundreds of AmeriCorps members that are serving. What are you going to do, executive director of that office? And I thought, there's people that believe that I can make the right decisions. So I will make the right decisions because if they believe in me, I should believe in me. And so, for sure.
I think that's a valid point. Sometimes we have to just say, I've been put in this role because of my passion, that I'm drawn to it, but other people believe that I have not only the passion, but the skill set to get the work done. And sometimes we just have to remind ourselves of those things.
We talked about before we hit recording is I coined a phrase for AmeriCorps alums is during your AmeriCorps year, the little slogan is getting things done. And my little catch on that is still getting things done. And again, a through line on all of these interviews is that we figure out how to get things done during our AmeriCorps year and after our AmeriCorps year. And that's where the confidence sets in, where a project can be put in front of us. And we're like, I don't know how to do this. And it's like, well, figure it out. I'll just get it done. Yeah. What were some of the highlight moments that you can remember during your time with Indiana Campus Compact that really highlighted some of those skills that were brought through your AmeriCorps year?
Yeah. Oh gosh, there's so
Probably
many.
so many.
I think
Episode number 2.
I think administering a statewide AmeriCorps
Oh,
program.
yeah.
So while I was at Indiana Campus Compact, we branched out from the Indiana Reading Corps program that still continued, and we were still placing full-time AmeriCorps members throughout the state of Indiana. But we branched out and did what we called Grow Indiana, which focused on STEM, and AmeriCorps member tutoring focused on science, technology, engineering, and math. What we didn't do with that program was STEAM, which came a little bit later, adding in that arts component. But I think the idea of putting together what would become a statewide AmeriCorps program, the knowledge that I brought with me already from being an AmeriCorps member, coupled with my experience then working in higher ed, and then being a full-time staff member at Indiana Campus Compact, all of that together helped me write that proposal to get funding to support a new statewide AmeriCorps Direct program in Indiana. So that was a highlight. Of course, I love talking to people. I'm a person that sometimes you have to take the mic away from me. Ask me a question, I'll talk for hours. You have to be like, okay, we got to transition. I love talking to people. I just love meeting people. I love the diversity of experience. I love the diversity of background. And I just really enjoyed getting to interact with people from 42 different kinds of college campuses across Indiana, 42 different institutions that attracted thousands of different kinds of college students, and then also faculty who were drawn to this work by many of the reasons like you and I were. Part of it's passion, part of it's wanting to make a difference and helping them achieve their goals through our work, giving them appropriate training, helping them connect to funding, and then seeing the kinds of projects that they developed in their own communities with their students. That's really special to see that happen. What's really interesting too, and you probably find this in your experience, I started to see the longer I was in my role at Indiana Campus Compact, faculty being hired at the institutions were AmeriCorps alums, right? They had
Yes.
gone through AmeriCorps experiences. They had gone and done their PhDs, and they're now teaching on a college campus, and they're bringing that AmeriCorps passion with them. And they want to connect it to the learning objectives of their course and get their students engaged in their communities. So that felt really special too, to be able to work in that kind of capacity with faculty and students.
And there's never a good time ever to leave when there's an AmeriCorps program involved or any programming, really, because it's so cyclical. So we do this, we have to apply, we have members that are coming in, members that are leaving. What made you feel like, okay, I'm going to step away and try something different?
Yeah, there were a few things, most namely, and this gets to what was an exciting experience during that 16-year time frame. Back in 2011, 2010, 2011, somewhere in there, before I became executive director and I was the associate director, my executive director, Dr. Maggie Stevens, had gotten a book in the mail called Where Am I Wearing? A Global Adventure to the People, to the Countries, Places, and People That Make Our Clothes. Kelsey's going to kill me for messing up the subtitle of his book.
It's okay, Kelsey.
By Kelsey Timmerman. And she said, hey, I talked to this guy. He sent me the book. He's interested in being a speaker for our conference. Would you take the book home and read it and let me know what you think about it and if you think he makes sense to be our keynote speaker for our annual conference? So I was like, okay. So I took the book home, I read it, loved the story. It was about him traveling around the world and living with garment workers, people who work in factories and make our clothes and the products that we take advantage of every day. And sometimes maybe don't think about where they come from or the story of the tag, right? You may see made in Honduras, but you don't necessarily think about the person who made that and then what their life is like day to day. And what he did is unpack those stories. He traveled around to all these factories and unpacked the stories in the book. So I loved it. I felt like it was a great connection point for our students and faculty to hear this inspiring story, because at conferences, we want those inspirational keynotes. But while I was reading the book, I realized that he lived in Muncie, Indiana.
No.
All roads lead back to Muncie. So
All roads lead back to Muncie. I
all
love
roads
that.
lead to Muncie. Well, they do say Indiana is the crossroads of America. So I don't know, maybe there's something about that. But so I go to the office on Monday and I said, Maggie, okay, I love this book. Yes, I think we should bring him. But he also lives in Muncie. Would you mind if I reached out and asked him if we could have
Yeah.
coffee? And she was like, oh, no, totally fine. So I reached out to him and I was like, hi, I'm Maggie's associate director, read your book. And so he and I met here in Muncie for coffee. And we talked about his book. We talked about him being a speaker. And we realized in that conversation that we lived in the same neighborhood. And it was like, how did we live in this space just blocks away from each other, but our lives had never really crossed? So we had a conversation around that. So we ended up having this long coffee conversation that accomplished many things, guaranteeing that he'd be our keynote, guaranteeing that we'd use his book in some way, and also a commitment that we would remain connected as neighbors, which then led to him convincing me to begin volunteering with him in an organization called Teamwork for Quality Living, which was a poverty-serving org here in our community that is now rolled into Second Harvest Food Bank. And they had an initiative called the Circles Program that connected individuals who signed up for the program self-identified as being in poverty in some way, and they're connected with other individuals who maybe don't identify as living in poverty, but they work together over an 18-month period to help the captain of the group achieve whatever goal it is they may want to achieve. Sometimes that's helping them make connections, sometimes. So I was involved in that program, and you've heard the story, so I'll quickly share it because the listeners maybe haven't. But an economist around 2011, 2012, once I had gotten involved in Teamwork with Kelsey, had written this piece in our community about an op-ed piece about our community and the poverty statistic, which at that time was hovering around 43%. And there were many reasons for that, most namely factory closures that were in the Rust Belt. Factories had shuttered by the late aughts. Some had moved elsewhere, but mainly it was due to automation. But people didn't leave the community even though they had lost their jobs. So our poverty stat had skyrocketed. Well, this economist was saying that stat included college students, and in his opinion, college students should be extracted from the data because they're not actually poor. They're only living in situational poverty. But my experience as an AmeriCorps member, my experience working in higher ed, my experience in Indiana Campus Compact, I knew college students who had lived in their cars to make it through school. I knew college students who had couch surfed to make it because they couldn't afford rent on top of everything else. Lots of students who needed full financial aid assistance. Many students, myself included, who were first-generation students, and they maybe didn't have the roadmap to make it through successfully higher ed. So this blanket statement that college students should be extracted from the data because all of them are only in situational poverty just didn't sit well with me. It didn't sit well with Kelsey. It didn't sit well with Molly Flotter, who was the executive director of Teamwork. So we started having a conversation about how do we help people talk about the stories behind those statistics, because every stat has a story behind it. And of course, Kelsey and I both had writing backgrounds. He was the author. I had a degree in writing. We started talking about how could we help people tell their story around poverty. And we quickly learned, once we started working with individuals who said, yeah, I'd love to tell my story to get it out there to combat this conversation, we quickly learned that not everybody could write their own story.
Yeah.
Some people had never learned to read or write, which was like pull a page right out of my AmeriCorps experience. So we had to step back and say, well, how do we make this an equitable experience so that if somebody wants to tell their story, they can? So we get the idea of partnering writers with the storytellers, regardless if you could write your own story, and everybody would have a storytelling partner. And the writer would help get the story on the page as if they were the storyteller, in the storyteller's voice, and the storyteller would have control of that narrative. So we did that. We collected about 21 stories. We put them in a booklet. We worked with our local theater, brought them to life on stage, and then shared those booklets out throughout the community to have conversations about poverty in our community. We felt like, okay, we got people talking. This is what we wanted to do. What we did not expect is that other nonprofits in our community would start to say, hey, we saw this thing that you did on facing poverty. We either got the booklet or we attended the monologue event or we went to one of the listening circles. we would love if you'd help us tell our story on autism, tell our story
Wow.
on addiction. And so Kelsey and I started saying yeah, but then we took a step back because after a year of saying yeah, it was a lot. It became a bit unwieldy because we both had full-time jobs. We were writers. We had families. I was commuting 3 hours a day to Indianapolis for my job at Indiana Campus Compact. So we started to say, does it really make sense for us to lead these projects? And the answer to that was no. But what we could do was put together a toolkit and a trainer model to say, we will train you on our process so that you can then work with storytellers and writers in your community to train them on the writing method, to collect their narratives around the topic that means the most to you, to have deep conversations around your own stories about what you want to change through your own narratives. So that became the Facing Project, which we launched officially as a non-official organization in 2014 and then became an official nonprofit in 2017. But that's a very long story to get our listeners back to the question you asked, what are you doing now after a 16-year career at Indiana Campus Compact? I'm now leading the Facing Project full time and have been for the last 4 years. And it feels really rewarding. That felt like a natural transition out. When we got our first large grant in 2021 from a donor to hire our first full-time staff member, Kelsey was in his MFA program at the time. He was like, I don't really have time to take this on full time. Our board really wanted it to be one of the two of us as we launched into this new era of our work. And so I felt like it was the right time for me to transition out after 16 years at Indiana Campus Compact into doing this thing I'd been doing as a side project for many years. And so that's now what I'm doing. And I get to wake up every day and help people tell their stories around really tough topics and get people in communities talking about these topics and issues, and not just talking about it, but what are they going to do now that they know about it?
I think one of the biggest takeaways from that story is to follow the synchronicities and the opportunities. And the universe speaks sometimes in whispers. And if you're not getting it, it throws a brick at your head.
Yeah.
But to me, your story sounds like you kept hearing these whispers and there was this path that you needed to follow. And it was like doors needed to open. And the way that you tell the story, it makes it sound like, oh, this was just an easy thing. And he moved from Campus Compact and then he got a lot of recognition and then he opened this other company and now he's executive director.
No.
But there's the nuances in between. I like to say the tip of the iceberg, everything underneath is what builds that purpose or passion that you have where people see. And they see the final product. They see the final Facing Project. And you have
not the years, right? The years of time that it takes to build. And
then the negotiations and also finding your boundaries and where can you bring, like, what projects and opportunities are you willing to really bring in and focus on? Because there's a ton of problems in a ton of communities that could be, we need to face this problem.
Yeah.
You have to be discerning. How do we stay true to our values, our boundaries?
Mm-hmm.
And when you're growing as a business, it's important.
Yeah. And that was part of the reason, too, why we said, does it really make sense for us to go in on the ground and lead these projects, especially as it started to grow outside of Muncie? Because other people in neighboring communities started to hear about this and it spread into other counties. And then we decided, okay, let's pilot this outside of Indiana to see what this could look like if it moved beyond Indiana, because it was starting to build momentum. And we started working with communities, trying to be on the ground, helping them lead these projects. And did that make sense? And there, like you said, there are so many topics and issues and stories that are untold that need to be told. Does Kelsey, we together really have the capacity to do that? And the answer is no. And you have to recognize that in yourself. And so the easy answer to that is we have the tools in the model. We can teach other people to do this. And maybe that's our goal. Maybe that is what our calling is, right? What we're meant to be doing is saying, no, Chicago, I can't lead a project for you on addiction, But I will share my materials with you. I'll work together in training you. I'll make sure that the writers and storytellers understand how to do listening sessions and collect the narratives. And I'll do all of these pieces that get you ready to launch your own project in your community. And so that kind of spread from there. And that's why if somebody goes to our website, they're like, wow, there are so many topics that have been faced. But the reality is, those are other individuals across the country in various communities who said, I believe in storytelling too. I believe in the stories behind statistics, and we need to have a deeper discussion. And I think this is the right model to get us there. And they led the project. And that could have never happened unless we stepped beyond ourselves to say, hey, this doesn't make sense for us to be the people leading this in every community.
I think that this loops back to what we were talking about, humility and not having the imposter syndrome, but then also having a little bit of humility. Am I really the right person to be doing this? It's important to step back. And it's that equity piece of, I love how there's this equity piece that's coming out of storytelling. How do you use somebody's, I don't know if you use the right word, but I'm just going to say use somebody's story to show the need for change or the impact or whatever you might be focusing on. And for you all to take that responsibility and say, okay, we've been doing this, and sure, we can tell these stories because this is what we are great at. But then there was a little piece of humility there, whereas is it really my responsibility to tell the story of this community that I'm not even part of?
Yeah.
So talk a little bit about that value within the Facing Project and why it seems like it's the core of making these projects so impactful.
Yeah. Well, part of it is we don't live in these communities that have adopted the model. And so part of it too is, does it make sense, going back to that, to me be a person going to Manhattan, Kansas to lead a Facing project on hunger? No, it makes more sense for the people on the ground who have spent years studying hunger, studying their community, looking at their community-based asset mapping. Like, I wasn't a part of those conversations, but what I have is a tool that I can train them on to help them say, now we can look at our own narratives using this. We can connect two people together to work on these individual stories, which then creates kind of empathy of two people working together to carry a story across the finish line. And then you bring in the broader community to discuss their own stories. And it's really hard to say, well, hunger is not an issue here when you're looking at these stories and they are all place-based. They are all done by writers and storytellers in your community. And so it's hard to shy away from that. That then lends itself to the deeper conversation where in our model, then we say in our toolkit, here are the listening circles you can put together to then have facilitated opportunities for the broader community to say, these are our stories. How can I get involved? Where is my place in this story? And then on the other side, when we look at writers and storytellers, what we often hear from storytellers is it helped them determine the kind of story or the way they want to share their story with others. So if I were to say to you, for instance, say you were in a situation of facing hunger, Nikki, tell me your story about facing hunger. Right? Like, where do you begin? And you may begin, and it
I'm
might
hungry.
be here, maybe like A to M to C to K to, like, it would be all over the place. But working with a listening partner helps the storyteller get on the page that story that's in 1,000 words or less, which is the sweet spot for somebody who's reading a story, because these are mosaics. They're typically 20, 25 stories per project. That's 25,000 words. That's the sweet spot for a reader to take this in and say, okay, I have these stories. I'm ready to have a discussion. And so that helps storytellers determine what is the right story to tell. And we've heard from storytellers that now when they go advocate for themselves outside of the work that they did with their Facing project, they can easily talk to people about, this is my story on hunger, and this is why it is important for you to care. So there's kind of this other piece there too, where it really helps people determine, how do I tell my story?
Oh my gosh. I didn't even think about this aspect of, okay, we're going to have to land the plane soon, but I didn't even think about the aspect of the impact of somebody telling their story and then going through the process of telling their story and then really honing in on what their story is, and then the impact of them going out and telling that story so succinctly. Because during the previous conversation we had is that you said sometimes people are so close to their stories, the details are a little convoluted, where they're like, they can't, but if somebody's listening to it, they're like, but this led to that and that led to this. And oh my God, that's accurate. And on the second hand is the person that's listening to this story to go out and talk about the impact of whatever that story was. Bro, this is
absolutely.
massive.
So, so when you look at just the writer and storyteller, say that there are 25 in a project, that's really 50 people who are helping shape the stories and learning through the process as well, and then becoming advocates, those who have lived through the experience, knowing how to advocate for themselves and their story. And those who often are writing on the stories may know a bit about the topic, but they're really learning from their storytelling partner as they're getting to know them over a series of months and crafting their narrative. And then all of a sudden you have 50 advocates, right, out of 25 stories who are going out in the community talking about what, for instance, hunger might mean in that community.
And also through your train the trainer, you're giving skills to people to actively listen. And then I don't know what the word would be, but like actively listen and then put together the story. But then also the storyteller is learning how to tell their story and think through some of their blind spots where, actually, I have a hard time in my own life of being, I went to a doctor's appointment today and they're like, how long has this been going on? I was like, I don't know. I couldn't even tell the story of inflammation in my fingers.
And it helps writers too. So I will say as a writer, selfishly being involved in many projects, it's helped me rethink my approaches to writing in many ways. Because yes, I'm helping a storyteller in all the ways we just talked about, but sometimes too, the storyteller will say, this isn't quite hitting the mark of what I was hoping. And there's a deeper discussion there. And oftentimes it includes filling in some maybe things a writer left out, where sometimes that happens on the other end, where somebody doesn't totally know how to fully tell their story and the writer's kind of probing them to get that. But there's sometimes where a writer might leave something out and the storyteller says, well, I'd shared this and that's actually really important to me, and I really want us to focus here. And it's an experience for a writer to really think about, how do I write someone's story in the first person and stay authentic to their voice, which is not easy to do. So it's really a lesson to writers too, to help them think about beyond facing project. If I'm writing a story, if it's going to be a fiction piece or a nonfiction piece, or I'm writing an essay, or maybe I'm doing marketing copy for something, what is the authentic voice that I want to use based on my audience and based on the message I'm trying to convey? So it ticks all the boxes of everything that I love. And I'm just so grateful that I get to wake up every day and do this work.
That's so cool. Okay. So let's land the plane. So I'm going to ask you two questions. What are you super excited about right now with the work that you're doing that you need these listeners that are going to subscribe to this YouTube because they're going to build the algorithms that you want them to know? And then the final question I'm going to ask you is, what would you love to see this AmeriCorps alumni group do? So first, starting off with, what are you excited about? What do you want to promote?
We're just talking about, how do you tell your story? And I don't know. I don't know what I want to promote. I would just say I always love seeing new people take on facing project ideas. So if people visit our website, which is just facingproject.com, they can learn ways to connect. I love seeing new projects that way. We have several projects in the hopper, which I'm excited about, including one here in our hometown on Middletown. So Muncie is considered Middletown, USA. It's one of the most studied communities in the United States. The Linds, who were sociologists, came here in 1924 that began now going on to a little more than 100-year study on our community. But we've always been studied, and what this project is doing through Facing Middletown is telling our story through our own narratives, but through the lens of a sociological perspective of the Linds and what was important to them to understand about our community. So really excited about that. Of course, we have the Facing Project radio show, which we didn't talk about, but We started a partnership with NPR through our home station of Indiana Public Radio back in 2018. So if people want to subscribe to the Facing Project, wherever you get your podcasts, you can hear stories from past Facing projects that we have voice actors perform. We'll bring on national experts to talk about those stories. And sometimes I'll interview other artists and authors and people who are doing creative work around empathy to talk to them about their work. So I want to promote that. And of course, I'm an author. So any of my books that I'm working on, my memoir came out a few years ago. So check that out if you're interested. It's steeped in empathy and all the work that I do. It's about traveling back to rural Missouri with my father, who we're on very different, we have very different political beliefs. And we traveled to rural Missouri during the height of the 2016 election to find truths about our family's past. So if you're interested in that, check that out. And I'm currently working on a couple of different fiction books that I hope will be out in the next couple of years.
That's so exciting. Okay. And I wrangled you into this conversation because you are an AmeriCorps alum. So thinking about this 1.3 million of us, some of us aren't around anymore, but what would you, with all of your experience, I don't know, give us the JR rendition of AmeriCorps alums 6.0.
Yeah. I would say that we were drawn to this work because we are passionate and we're curious. Those are the two things that brought us into it. Maybe our paths weren't all the same, but it sounds like our paths maybe were similar. So maybe others were like that too, trying to figure out what the heck am I going to do? I know I care about X, Y, and Z, and oh, wow, here's AmeriCorps. Keeping that passion alive over time can sometimes not happen because of different responsibilities that we have. We get partners, we get married, we have kids, our careers take us down different paths. Maybe we have a parent we're taking care of. Those of us who are AmeriCorps members who maybe are at the middle stage of our life, I would say, and really this is relevant to anybody, if you're fresh out of AmeriCorps or you are at retirement age or you're in the middle place, is staying true to your passion. And so any project that I take on, if it's a writing project, if it's work that I'm doing a facing project, if it's something I'm trying to decide because somebody asked me like, hey, do you want to do this thing with me? And I have to ask the question, the what, why, and how. So everything I approach, I say, what is it that I care about in this moment? Why do I care about this thing? And how am I going to get other people to care about it too? And so knowing the answer to each of those three questions keeps you on course to staying an engaged citizen in your community. And that what, why, and how may change over time, and that's okay. So my memoir, I tell people, for instance, the what, why, and how for me was seeing this political divide in 2016 that has really gotten worse over time. But in 2016, I was saying, I want to change this. I want to be part of the change in this area. And I could do that, right, through connecting with my dad, who's vastly different, to find our connection points back to one another. But that changes over time. That may not be the thing I care about the most right now. So reminding ourselves that our passions may change, but looking at our purpose, and our purpose is that what, why, and how. What is it I care about it? Why do I care about it? And how am I going to make other people care about it too?
I couldn't say anything more. Thank you so much for being a guest on the AmeriCorps Connections podcast. JR, this was great. We could have talked for so much longer, but maybe we'll do a follow-up. So all of you who listen, thank you so much. Don't forget to subscribe and stay true to yourself, find your purpose, follow your passion, and continue getting things done.
Thank you so much for having me. It was such a joy to sit with you and reminisce and also talk about the importance of AmeriCorps.
So good. Thank you so much.
Yep.
Bye, everyone.